Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're going to unpack a specific federal document, one that's really setting the direction for policy across the executive branch. It's called Restoring Biological Truth in Federal Government, and it's a presidential order dated January 2025.
That's the one. And our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, it's pretty straightforward, really. We're just going to walk through this document piece by piece.
Right.
We want to understand its stated purpose, look at the specific definitions it sets up, for sex and gender identity for the federal government, and really detail what it tells agencies they need to do.
Exactly. And importantly, we're sticking strictly to the text, just what's inside this one source document. So whether you're, say, prepping for a meeting or just trying to get your head around a major policy shift.
Or maybe just curious.
Or just curious, understanding a document like this, how it defines things, how it directs action, well, it's pretty fundamental. So let's get started.
Okay, so the document kicks off in Section 1 by laying out its purpose and the problem it sees itself as addressing. It states the purpose is about defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. That's the title, essentially.
And the problem, well, the way the document describes it is that there are ideologues who deny biological sex. It says these people are using legal channels, social pressure, things like that, to allow men who identify as women into women-only spaces. It gives examples like domestic abuse shelters or even workplace showers.
And the document is very direct about its view on this. It says this is wrong. It argues that trying to, quote, eradicate the biological reality of sex fundamentally attacks women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being.
That's strong language.
It is, and it goes broader, claiming this erasure of sex hurts not just women, but the validity of the entire American system and even public trust in government.
Wow. Okay, so according to this source, what's the root cause here? How does it say this is happening?
It describes it as an ongoing and purposeful attack against the ordinary and long-standing use and understanding of biological and scientific terms. Basically, the document claims this attack is trying to replace the immutable biological reality of sex.
Immutable meaning unchanging.
Right, unchanging biological reality. Replacing that with an internal, fluid, and subjective sense of self unmoored from biological facts.
So subjective feeling over biology is the argument.
That's how the document frames it. And it argues that invalidating the, quote, true and biological category of woman undermines protections based on sex. It says these are being replaced by an identity-based inchoate social concept.
Inchoate meaning sort of vague or not fully formed.
Exactly. So the administration's stated goal, right there in the text, is to defend women's rights, protect freedom of conscience by making sure federal language and policies recognize women as biologically female and men as biologically male, period.
Okay, that really sets out the document's why, the justification, which naturally leads us to, well, maybe the most crucial part, Section 2. This is where it lays down the core policy and, critically, the specific definitions this document wants the entire executive branch to use.
Absolutely. This section is foundational. The core policy, just reading from it, is that the United States recognizes two sexes, male and female. The document says these are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality.
Incontrovertible, meaning undeniable, essentially.
Yes, and it directs the executive branch to enforce laws that protect sex-based rights based on this reality.
And then come the definitions. It says, these definitions shall govern all executive interpretation of and application of federal law and administration policy. So these aren't suggestions, they're directives. Let's break these down. They seem really key.
Definitely key. So first, sex. The document defines sex as an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female.
Okay, immutable again.
And it explicitly adds, this is important, sex is not a synonym for and does not include gender identity.
Right, drawing a very sharp line between those two concepts. What about the terms for people like woman or man?
Pretty straightforward based on the sex definition. Women or woman and girls or girl mean adult and juvenile human females, respectively.
And men or man, boys or boy.
Adult and juvenile human males, respectively.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? It goes into the biology it's using for these terms.
It does, yeah. It defines female as a person belonging, at conception, to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell, the ovum.
At conception, okay.
And male is defined as a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell, sperm. So very specific, biologically anchored definitions provided right in the text.
Okay, so that covers sex, male, female, man, woman, boy, girl. What about the terms gender ideology and gender identity? How does the document define those? Because it clearly distinguishes them from sex.
Right. It defines gender ideology as essentially the belief system that replaces biological sex with what it calls an ever-shifting concept of self-assessed gender identity.
Okay.
Goes on to say this ideology allows the false claim, the document uses that word false, that males can identify as women and become women, and that it requires institutions to accept this claim as true.
Does it say anything else about this ideology?
Yeah, it also describes gender ideology as internally inconsistent. It argues, how can it diminish the importance of biological sex, but also claim people can be born in the wrong body, which seems to imply some biological link. That's the inconsistency the document points out.
Interesting point it makes there. And gender identity itself, how is that defined?
According to this specific document, gender identity is described as reflecting a fully internal and subjective sense of self, disconnected from biological reality and sex, and existing on an infinite continuum.
Disconnected from biology, internal, subjective.
Yes. And crucially, the document then states that gender identity, quote, does not provide a meaningful basis for identification and cannot be recognized as a replacement for sex.
So just to really hammer this home for everyone listening, these are the definitions the specific document establishes. This is the rule book, so to speak, for the executive branch according to this order.
Exactly right. And with those core concepts defined, the document naturally moves on to Section 3, which is all about implementation. How do agencies actually do this?
Right, making it happen.
So it directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, to issue detailed guidance, sort of expanding on these definitions within 30 days.
Pretty quick turnaround. And what about other agencies? All of them?
Yeah, it tells all federal agencies, all employees, they need to enforce rights, protections, opportunities, accommodations that are based on sex by recognizing men and women as biologically distinct sexes.
And there's a specific instruction about language, isn't there?
A very specific one. Agencies must use the term sex and not gender in their relevant policies, documents, communications. Basically, whenever they're dealing with sex-based distinctions, use sex, not gender.
That seems like a significant shift in terminology.
It definitely is, and it gets quite granular with how this plays out. It tells the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security and the head of the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, to change government-issued IDs.
Like what kind of IDs?
Things you carry every day, potentially. Passports, visas, global entry cards. They need to be updated to accurately reflect the holder's sex, as defined under Section 2 of this order.
Using that biological immutable definition.
Correct. And OPM also needs to make sure federal employee personnel records use that same definition of sex from the order.
That's a really concrete change affecting documents many people have. What else does it tell agencies about, say, their websites or publications? And federal funding?
Good question. Agencies are told to basically scrub their materials. They have to remove all statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications, or other internal and external messages that promote or otherwise inculcate gender ideology, and stop making new ones.
So a cleanup of existing materials.
Yeah, and any agency form that asks for sex, it shall list male or female and shall not request gender identity. Very explicit.
And the funding part.
Also explicit. Agencies need to take steps to end the federal funding of gender ideology. This includes looking at grants to make sure taxpayer money isn't being used for purposes that align with gender ideology as defined in this document.
Okay. The document also tackles a specific Supreme Court case, doesn't it? Bostock.
Yes, Bostock v. Clayton County from 2020. This is a really significant part of Section 3. The document argues that the previous administration's interpretation of Bostock,
which dealt with employment discrimination.
Right. The document claims the prior view, which it says applied Bostock to require access to single-sex spaces based on gender identity, like under Title IX in schools, is legally untenable and has harmed women.
Strong words again, legally untenable.
Very. So it directs the Attorney General to immediately issue guidance, telling agencies to correct this, quote, misapplication of Bostock when it comes to sex-based distinctions. The goal is to help agencies protect sex-based spaces and rules that existing court decisions still allow, according to this order's interpretation.
So it's effectively ordering a reinterpretation and different application of a major Supreme Court ruling by the executive branch, specifically targeting things like single-sex spaces and protections.
That's precisely what the text directs, based on its own legal reasoning.
Yep.
Okay, moving from the general directives Section 4 zooms in specifically on privacy in intimate spaces.
This ties back to the concerns mentioned right at the beginning about shelters and showers and so on. What are the specific instructions here?
It tells the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to make sure males are not detained in women's prisons or housed in women's detention centers.
How are they supposed to do that?
It points to amending a specific federal rule, 28 CFR 115.41, and also interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, in line with this goal.
Interesting connection to the ADA there. What about shelters?
It directs HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to scrap a 2016 rule. The old rule was called Equal Access in Accordance with an Individual's Gender Identity.
Okay, get rid of that.
And replace it. Propose a new policy aimed at protecting women in single-sex shelters, and it specifically calls out rape shelters as an example.
And medical care in federal prisons. Does it touch on that?
It does. It instructs the Attorney General to ensure the Bureau of Prisons revises its medical policies to be consistent with this order. And it explicitly says no federal funds are expended for any medical procedure, treatment, or drug for the purpose of conforming an inmate's appearance to that of the opposite sex.
So, no federal funding for gender-affirming medical care in prisons, according to them.
That's what the text states. The overall policy this section lays out for intimate spaces is clear. Designation by biological sex. It's defined earlier, not by gender identity, for both females and males.
Okay. Then Section 5 seems to broaden the scope again, talking about rights under the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. This section directs the Attorney General, plus other agencies involved in enforcing the Civil Rights Act, like the Department of Labor, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to do a couple of things.
Which are?
Issue guidance, and also prioritize investigations in litigation.
Prioritize enforcement. Focused on what?
Focused on protecting what the document calls the freedom to express the binary nature of sex and also the right to single-sex spaces.
Okay.
This applies to workplaces and any federally funded places covered by the Civil Rights Act, all interpreted through the lens of this document's definitions of sex, male, and female.
So it's not just defining terms, it's directing active legal enforcement based on those definitions. Okay. We're nearing the end of the document itself. Sections 6 and 7 deal with making this permanent and undoing past actions.
Pretty much. Section 6 is short. It just directs the administration to present proposed legislation to Congress within 30 days to write these definitions into actual law to codify them.
Trying to make it more permanent than just an executive order.
That's exactly. And Section 7 requires agencies to report back on how they're implementing all this within 120 days. But crucially, Section 7 also does the cleanup of past policies.
This is where it formally cancels things out.
Yes, this is significant. Section 7 states clearly this order supersedes conflicting provisions in any previous executive orders or presidential memoranda. And it doesn't just say that generally, it rescinds specific previous orders by name and date.
Which ones does it list?
It lists several. EO 13988 from Jan 20, 2021, EO 1474 from Jan 25, 2021, two orders from March 8, 2021, 4278 and 14021, and EO 1475 from June 15, 2022.
So basically wiping out key orders from the previous administration related to gender identity and equality.
That appears to be the direct effect. It also explicitly dissolves the White House Gender Policy Council, which was created by one of those rescinded orders, EO 14020.
A whole council gone. What about specific guidance documents from agencies, not just the big executive orders?
It covers those too. The order tells agencies to promptly rescind any guidance docs that clash with this new order or with the new Attorney General guidance that's supposed to come out.
Does it give examples?
It does. It lists things like the White House Toolkit on Transgender Equality, certain Department of Education guidance documents mentioning Title IX ones, and guidance on supporting LGBTQI+ students, the Attorney General's memo from March 2021 about applying Bostock to Title IX.
The one it criticized earlier.
Exactly. And even a fairly recent EOC guidance document, the Enforcement Guidance on Harassment in the Workplace, from April 29, 2024.
So it's directing a pretty thorough dismantling of previous guidance across several key areas: education, justice, employment, anything related to gender identity conflicting with this new orders framework.
Yes, the directive is to systematically reverse or remove a range of prior administrative actions and guidance based on its incompatibility with this new order. And then finally, you have Section 8, which is mostly standard legal boilerplate.
Right, the usual stuff at the end. Things like The order has to be implemented consistent with existing law and available funding. It doesn't create any new rights that someone can sue over directly, and a severability clause.
Meaning if a court strikes down one part, the rest of the order is intended to still stand.
Correct.
Okay. That was a really detailed walkthrough of this specific document.
Right.
We focused entirely on what restoring biological truth in federal government actually says.
We've covered its stated reasoning, those very specific definitions it puts in place for sex, male, female, gender ideology, gender identity, and the really wide-ranging instructions it gives to federal agencies. Instructions covering everything from the language they use, to government IDs, how federal money is spent, specific rules for prisons and shelters.
Interpretations affecting schools and workplaces through Title IX and the Civil Rights Act, and of course, rescinding a whole slate of previous policies and guidance.
And again, just to be crystal clear for you listening, our goal here was simply to understand what this document directs, using its own terms and arguments.
Exactly. It's clearly a document designed to reset the federal government's approach, establishing these specific biological definitions for sex and gender identity as the foundation for policy and implementation moving forward. It directs agencies to make some pretty substantial changes based on those definitions.
So thinking about all that, as federal agencies now have to start implementing these very specific definitions and directives, here's a question for you to consider, based purely on what we've discussed from this source document. How might this single document's very specific approach to defining sex and gender identity ultimately reshape the way existing federal laws and protections laws that often just use the word sex are interpreted and applied across the board?
Yeah, that's a key question that flows directly from the text itself and the actions it mandates.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.